Cutters Creek, Montana territory, January 16th, 1882. The thermometer outside Prentice Callaway's trading post read 42 degrees below zero. Adelaide Vance had been walking for 11 minutes through the kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it reaches inside a person and squeezes. Her wool coat, the heaviest one she owned, felt like paper against that wind. Her eyelashes had begun to frost at the corners. Each breath came out as a solid white cloud that the wind tore away before it could form. She was walking toward a hole in a hillside. She carried a folded wool blanket under one arm and a basket of bread and salted pork under the other. The bread had already frozen solid. She told herself she was doing a Christian duty. She told herself that someone had to check. She told herself that Cornelius didn't need to know, not yet, because what she expected to find on the other side of that hillside door was something a neighbor shouldn't have to see confirmed. She expected to find a family in crisis. She expected hollow-cheeked children and a desperate man finally ready to admit what every soul in Cutters Creek had known since September. That Lars Solberg had made a fatal mistake. The entrance to the tunnel appeared through the snow like something from a fever dream. A stone archway recessed 4 feet into the hillside, partially drifted, but still accessible. A narrow path had been cleared that morning. Thin smoke rose from somewhere above the hill's peak, a pale thread against the iron-gray sky. Adelaide stood at the entrance for a long moment. She knocked. Footsteps. Then the sound of a latch. The door opened. Lars Solberg stood in the doorway, wearing a simple wool shirt and work trousers. No coat. No blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His dark blonde hair was neatly combed the way a man combs his hair when he is settled and comfortable in his own home. He looked at Adelaide with calm blue eyes and the faint trace of something that might have been amusement. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "Come in. Coffee's hot." The warmth hit Adelaide like a physical thing. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, and the howling Montana winter ceased to exist. Cutters Creek, Montana territory, August 1881. 5 months earlier, Lars Solberg arrived in Cutters Creek with a wagon, 3 children, $40, and a dead wife's name. Ingrid Solberg had died in May, 3 weeks outside of Minneapolis, from a fever that came on fast and left no room for argument. She was 37 years old. She had been the kind of woman whose quiet competence made everything around her run better, without anyone fully noticing she was the reason why. The fever took her in 4 days. Lars had buried her in Minnesota soil, a long way from the Norwegian coast, where both of them had been born, and then he had picked up the reins himself and driven the wagon the rest of the way to Montana, because the land claim was already purchased, because the money was already spent, because he had 3 children who needed somewhere to go. Olin was 16, old enough to be useful, and young enough to still be frightened of things he didn't fully understand. Sigrid was 11, quiet, and watchful in the way that some children become when they have seen something that cannot be unseen. And Emmy was 8 years old, the kind of child whose laughter sounds like it belongs to a different, kinder world. Lars Solberg was 40 years old. He had gray appearing at his temples that had not been there the previous winter. His hands were rough from 6 weeks of driving and camp making and doing what needed doing without anyone to share the weight. He was not a large man by frontier standards, but he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had taken careful inventory of himself and found nothing he could afford to waste. The land claim was for 30 acres on the eastern edge of what the locals called Anderson Hill. It was the cheapest parcel in Cutters Creek by a significant margin. Prentice Callaway explained why on the first day, leaning against his trading post counter with the patience of a man who had explained the same thing before. "North-facing slope on the back 40, he said. "Ground's rocky up top. Nothing grows above the tree line, and the tree line isn't high. The south face is clay, which means drainage problems come spring. Other men looked at it. They all passed. What about the south face? Lars asked. Calloway looked at him. I just said, clay. Drainage problems. What's the depth of the clay layer? Calloway had no answer for that. He wasn't accustomed to being asked questions he couldn't answer, and he covered it by straightening some papers on the counter that didn't need straightening. Lars paid for his provisions, loaded his wagon, and drove to Anderson Hill alone to look at what he had bought. He stood at the base of the south face for a long time. He put his hand against the clay. He noted the angle of the slope, the way the hillside faced southeast, the way the prevailing wind came down from the northwest and broke against the ridge above. He took a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and made several notations in a small, precise hand. Then he drove back to the temporary shelter he had arranged for his children and opened the leather satchel he had carried from Norway to Minnesota to Montana without once leaving it unattended. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with cord. 41 pages written in his father's hand. Descriptions and diagrams of the game, the earthen homes that Norwegian families had carved into hillsides in Finnmark for generations. Temperature notations, structural calculations, ventilation designs that had been refined over 100 years of trial and survival in a climate that made Montana look forgiving. Lars's father had given him the papers the day he and Ingrid left Norway. He had pressed them into Lars's hands at the dock and said in Norwegian, "There will come a winter in America when you will need to know what the earth can do." Lars had read those 41 pages many times on the crossing. He had read them again on the journey from Minneapolis. He had read them a final time while sitting beside Ingrid's grave in Minnesota, and in that reading, he had begun to understand something his father had perhaps not fully articulated. The papers described a system built for Finnmark. For specific soil types, specific hillside angles, specific wind patterns on the Norwegian coast. Anderson Hill was not Finnmark, but the principles were the same. The Earth's temperature at depth was the same, approximately 52 degrees stable year-round, regardless of what the air above it chose to do. The physics of thermal mass were the same. The mechanics of ventilation were the same. What was different was the application. The angle of the entry tunnel, the depth and placement of the ventilation shaft relative to the hill's peak, the positioning of the firebox relative to the prevailing wind. These he had been calculating in his head for 3 weeks before he ever saw Anderson Hill, when he finally stood at the south face with his hand against the clay. He was not looking at a drainage problem. He was looking at a thermal battery. The announcement came on a Tuesday afternoon in September at Callaway's trading post, which served Cutter's Creek as general store, post office meeting hall, and the closest thing the settlement had to a newspaper. 17 men were present. Cornelius Vance was among them. Vance was 58 years old and had built 23 structures across 3 territories. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been made for the specific purpose of lifting heavy things. He spoke in a measured, deliberate way that carried the authority of someone who had learned things the hard way and never forgot the lesson. The people of Cutter's Creek trusted Cornelius Vance's opinion on construction the way they trusted Dr. Greer's opinion on fever, not because they were required to, but because the evidence had accumulated over years. Lars spread his drawings on Callaway's counter. He had drawn them cleanly, precisely, with measurements marked at every critical point. The tunnel entry at the southeast face. The primary chamber 12 feet wide and 14 feet long. The sleeping alcoves carved directly into the clay walls. The corner firebox with its horizontal flue run. The ventilation shaft angled upward at 70 degrees through the hill's peak lined with split cedar fitted with a rotating cap. He explained the design in clear, deliberate English. He described the thermal principle. He noted that at 16 feet of depth, the surrounding clay would maintain a temperature near 52 degrees regardless of outside conditions. He explained that his firebox would not be fighting 40 below air. It would be raising temperature from 52 degrees to a comfortable 65. 13 degrees of work instead of 100. The room was quiet when he finished. Then Vance reached out and picked up the top drawing. He studied it for a long moment. His expression did not change. He turned the page 90 degrees, studied it again, and set it back down on the counter with the care of a man who has decided something. "This is a root cellar," he said. "It is not," Lars said. "You're proposing to put your children in a hole in the ground. I am proposing to put my children in an engineered earth shelter with calculated ventilation, thermal mass insulation, and a firebox designed for the specific thermal load of the space." The words were precise and delivered without heat. Several men shifted. They were not accustomed to a newcomer speaking this way, with the vocabulary of an engineer and the composure of someone who has already thought through every objection and found none of them sufficient. Vance set the drawing down. "Where's your firebox going to draw?" he said. "That flue run is horizontal for 6 feet before it angles. You'll smoke your children out before you freeze them." "The horizontal run creates a heat exchanger effect," Lars said. "It warms the flue pipe before the gas rises, which creates a stronger draw, not a weaker one. The rotating cap at the shaft exit prevents downdraft in high winds." Vance looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of something that was not quite dismissal and not quite respect, and then the familiar armor closed back over it. "I've built 23 structures," he said. "I've seen men try clever ideas in hard country. Clever ideas kill people when the temperature drops to 40 below." "So does inadequate insulation," Lars said. The room was very quiet. Calloway cleared his throat. "Mr. Solberg," he said carefully, "the concern here is for your children's safety. Nobody doubts your resourcefulness. But Cornelius has more building experience than anyone in 3 counties. If he says there's a problem with the design, then he should show me the problem in the design," Lars said. He tapped the drawings. "Not in his experience, in this." Vance picked up the drawings and studied them for 3 full minutes. The room waited. Lars waited with it standing very still. "7 problems," Vance said finally. He set the drawings down and began to count on his fingers. "Moisture condensation on clay walls in temperature differentials, inadequate firebox capacity for the cubic footage, frost heave risk on the ceiling clay, compromised structural integrity without timber framing, ventilation shaft susceptible to wind shear collapse, smoke management in a below-grade space, and the entry vestibule design will create a cold trap, not block one." He looked at Lars. Lars looked back. He did not write the 7 points down. He did not need to. He had already considered every one of them. "I'll address each of those in construction," he said. "With what experience?" Vance asked. "With these," he said, and touched the drawings. Vance made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite contempt, but somewhere between the two. He looked at Calloway. He looked at the other men. He set the drawings down with the finality of a verdict delivered. "God help that family." Said what the men at Calloway's trading post did not know what Lars had not said, because he had not been asked and did not offer information where it was not requested, was the full extent of his preparation. The 41 pages from his father were only the beginning. For 3 weeks before the announcement, He had been testing the clay on Anderson Hill's south face. Not just touching it, testing it, taking samples at different depths, measuring moisture content by weight before and after drying, pressing clay samples into small molds, and measuring their thermal retention over time against known quantities. He had visited the hill at 5 in the morning when the air temperature was its coldest and pressed a thermometer probe he had purchased in Minneapolis into the ground at intervals of 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet. He had charted the results in a small notebook that no one in Cutter's Creek knew existed. At 6 feet of depth ground temperature was 44 degrees. At 10 feet, it was 49. At 14 feet, it was 51. At 16 feet, the depth he had chosen for the primary chamber floor, it was 52 degrees and 3/10. Stable, consistent, indifferent to the fact that the air above it was 38 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. He had also spent 2 evenings with Dr. Elias Greer, the settlement's physician, who occupied a small office above Callaway's trading post, and whose opinion nobody in Cutter's Creek had ever had cause to dismiss. Greer was 65 years old, with white hair and the careful eyes of a man who has learned to look at things rather than simply see them. He had trained in Philadelphia, practiced in 3 states, before coming west, and read more widely than anyone else in Cutter's Creek combined. He was not an engineer, but he understood physics in the way that doctors who pay attention come to understand it as a set of rules that applied whether you believed in them or not. Lars spread his drawings on Greer's desk. He walked him through the thermal principles. He showed him his ground temperature measurements. He explained the ventilation calculations and the specific problem of moisture management in an earthen structure through the full seasonal cycle. Greer listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions each, precise and specific, and Lars answered each one with the measurements to support it. When he finished, Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that nobody else in Cutter's Creek had said to Lars. "You've adapted the design," he said. "The Finnmark Gam is built for that geography. You've recalculated the ventilation angle and the firebox placement for this hill specifically." "Yes," Lars said. "Your father's notes don't account for this soil profile or this hillside geometry." "No, they give me the principles. The application is mine." Greer looked at the drawings for another long moment. "Your father built for Finnmark," he said quietly. "You're building for this hill." It was precisely what Lars had understood for 3 weeks, stated back to him in 10 words. He felt something loosen slightly in his chest, not relief exactly, but the particular comfort of being understood by someone whose understanding cost them something to offer. "I cannot tell you it will work," Greer said. "I'm not an engineer, but I can tell you that your calculations are internally consistent, that your measurements are more rigorous than anything I've seen a builder in this territory produce, and that the thermal principles are sound." He paused. "I will also tell you that if Emmy develops any respiratory symptoms that I attribute to dampness or air quality in the structure, I will be direct with you about what I observe. You will have that information as soon as I do." "That's all I ask," Lars said. Greer looked at him for a moment more. "You're going to do this regardless of what anyone says." "I bought the hill," Lars said. "My wife is buried in Minnesota. This is what I have." Greer nodded slowly. It was not a nod of approval or disapproval. It was the nod of a man acknowledging a fact that has weight and deserves to be acknowledged. "Then build it well," he said. Excavation began in the first week of October. Lars worked with a pickaxe and a short-handled spade. Olin worked beside him at first, reluctantly, then with the mechanical resignation of a boy who has lost the energy for protest. The clay was dense and consistent, which was good for structural integrity and bad for the pace of digging. They made progress in inches. The settlement watched. This was inevitable in a community of 17 families spread across 4 square miles of Montana territory. There was limited entertainment and significant mutual dependence, which meant that everyone's choices were everyone's business. The excavation of Anderson Hill's south face became a spectacle not dramatic enough to draw crowds, but persistent enough to attract comment. The comments were not kind. "The man's lost his mind with grief," said Ada Morrison, who meant it with genuine sympathy and said it to everyone she spoke to for 3 weeks. "It's not just foolish, it's dangerous," said Cornelius Vance at Callaway's Trading Post to anyone who had not yet heard his 7-point critique. "When that clay ceiling comes down in the first hard freeze, and it will come down, those children will be buried alive." Vance was not a cruel man. This is important to understand. He was a man who had built structures in hard country and watched some of them fail in ways that cost people dearly, and the weight of that experience had calcified into something that felt from the inside like wisdom and looked from the outside like certainty. He believed what he said. He believed it with the full force of his considerable professional confidence. He also, somewhere beneath that confidence, registered the drawings, the precision of them, the specificity of the measurements, the evidence that this man had thought about the problem in a way that suggested deep familiarity with the underlying principles. He registered it and set it aside because years of builds outweighed 41 pages, and because the man was a widower and a foreigner and was proposing to put his children in a hole in the ground in Montana in winter, and those 3 facts together were simply too loud for the quieter evidence to be heard above them. Olin Solberg heard the comments. He was 16, and 16 is an age when other people's opinions carry a weight that the opinions themselves don't deserve. He heard what was said about his father at the places boys go, at Callaway's fetching feed, collecting mail. He heard the particular quality of the silences when he came into a room. He heard Ada Morrison ask him with genuine and terrible kindness whether his father was sleeping enough. One evening in late October, he sat across from Lars at their camp stove. They were still in the temporary dwelling, the tunnel not yet habitable, and said what had been building in him for weeks. "People think you're wrong," he said. Lars looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "I know. Vance has built more than anyone else here." "He has." "What if he's right?" Lars was quiet for a moment. He looked at his son, at the fear in him, which he was trying to disguise as practicality, and at the grief underneath the fear, which had nowhere else to go. Ingrid's death lived in Olin in a way it didn't live in the younger children. He was old enough to understand what had been lost, and not old enough to know how to carry it. "Then we'll know when February comes," he said, "and we'll make another plan." "That's not an answer," Olin said. "It's the only honest one." Olin looked at the drawings spread across the camp table. Then he looked at his father's hands, the calluses, the clay still under his fingernails, despite washing the small cut on his right palm from the pickaxe handle. "I don't want to live in a hole," he said. "You may change your mind," Lars said, "when it's 40 below and the hole is the only warm place for 100 miles. He said it quietly, without heat, the way he said most things. Olin looked at him for a long moment, and then looked away, and that was the end of the conversation. But he showed up the next morning with the short-handled spade. He didn't announce this. He simply appeared at the hillside at first light with the spade over his shoulder, and Lars looked at him once, and then looked back at the clay and said nothing, and they worked side by side until the light gave out. This became the pattern of October, the two of them digging in the early cold, while Emmy and Sigrid managed the camp progress measured in feet per week rather than per day. the dark interior of the tunnel slowly taking the shape that existed on paper. November arrived with its particular Montana efficiency, not easing into cold, but arriving at cold as if warmth had simply been a temporary arrangement that had now expired. The tunnel was 14 feet deep. The primary chamber was roughed out its dimensions, established its sleeping alcoves carved into the east and west walls. The stone foundation at the entry was half-complete sandstone blocks, selected and fitted with the care Lars had described to Dr. Greer, each piece tested for its bearing surface, each joint chinked with a clay mortar he had mixed himself to a specific consistency. The work was visible from the path below the hill. Vance walked past it twice in the first week of November, once heading to the Henderson farm and once returning, and stopped both times to look. The second time, he climbed the short slope to the entry. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down into the tunnel. It was dark inside, lit only by the gray November light from the entry and a small lamp Lars had placed at the chamber's far end. He could see the carved sleeping alcoves. He could see the rough opening for the firebox in the corner. He could see the beginning of the ventilation shaft, bore in the ceiling, not a ragged hole, but a precise circular opening lined with cedar that had been split and fitted with care. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. The workmanship was better than he expected. The cedar lining of the shaft opening was done with a precision that suggested someone who understood why it needed to be precise. The alcove profiles were clean carved to consistent depth. The corner where the firebox would sit had been prepared with a stone base that was level and carefully fitted. He had expected rough work. This was not rough work. He climbed back down and walked on without a word. Whatever he thought in those 2 minutes he kept to himself. But that evening, for the first time since September, he did not mention Lars Solberg's tunnel at Callaway's trading post. In the third week of November, Emmy Solberg developed a fever. It came on a Wednesday morning, a flush and a heaviness, and a reluctance to eat that Lars recognized immediately and did not minimize. He sent Olin for Dr. Greer before the sun had fully risen. Greer arrived within the hour. He examined Emmy with his usual quiet thoroughness, checking her chest, her throat, her eyes, her skin temperature. He asked her questions in a gentle voice, and Emmy answered them in the small, careful voice of a sick child trying to be cooperative. Lars stood near the doorway of the temporary dwelling and watched. He did not hover. He did not volunteer information. He waited. Fever, Greer said finally. Common. Her lungs are clear. Her throat shows no evidence of serious infection. This is not a respiratory illness, and it is not connected to damp conditions, because she is not currently living in any. He looked at Lars. She needs rest, water, and time. I expect she'll be considerably better in 4 to 5 days. Thank you, Lars said. Greer paused at the door. There will be people who say this is evidence of what the tunnel will do. I know. They will be wrong in this instance. A child of Emmy's age contracts fevers in November, regardless of her housing. He paused again. I will be direct with you about anything I observe that gives me genuine cause for concern. This is not that. After he left, Lars sat beside Emmy and held her hand and looked at nothing for a long while. The temporary dwelling was cold in the way that temporary dwellings are cold, inadequately sealed, losing heat through every gap, the fire working hard to maintain a temperature that was functional but not comfortable. He thought about the primary chamber 14 feet into the hillside and the 52 degrees waiting quietly at that depth. And he held his daughter's hand and waited for the 4 days to pass. The news traveled as it always did. By afternoon, it had passed through 3 households and arrived at Callaway's trading post in the form that information takes when it has been carried by several people in succession enlarged, simplified, and pointed in a particular direction. The Solberg girl is sick, Calloway told the four men present that evening. Already, said one. They're not even in the tunnel yet, said Vance. This detail was noted. This detail was not considered to soften the larger point. By the following day, Cornelius Vance had spoken privately to 6 of the settlement's heads of household. By the day after, Calloway had agreed to convene a community meeting. It was presented as a matter of concern for the welfare of the Solberg children, and many of the people present genuinely believed that framing, because the feeling of concern was real, even if what it was being used to accomplish was something else. 17 settlers gathered at Calloway's trading post. Vance spoke first and longest. He reiterated his 7-point structural and thermal critique of the tunnel design. He described the specific risks of clay ceiling frost heave in deep cold. He noted that Emmy's illness, while perhaps minor now, was consistent with the kind of chronic respiratory vulnerability that damp earthen environments created in children. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the measured authority of a man who had built extensively in hard country and watched structures fail and was not willing to watch a family fail in the same way. When he finished, Calloway called for a show of hands. 14 hands went up requesting that Lars Solberg pause construction and arrange alternative winter housing for his children. 3 did not. Dr. Greer was one. The other 2 were men who had said nothing throughout the meeting and would say nothing about their votes afterward. Lars stood at the back of the room and watched the hands go up. His face was composed. He had expected this or something like it. He had prepared for it the way he had prepared for everything else, by thinking through it in advance and deciding what he would do. Calloway turned to him. Mr. Solberg, he said with what passed for gentleness in a man unaccustomed to delivering unwelcome verdicts, the sense of this community is not binding, Lars said. His voice was quiet and level and carried to every corner of the room. I hold the deed to that land. No one in this room has the legal authority to direct how I build on it or how I house my children. The room was very still. No one is suggesting, Calloway began. Emmy will be well within the week, Lars said. Dr. Greer has confirmed this. He looked at the room, not with defiance exactly, but with a quality of patience that was more unsettling than defiance would have been. I appreciate the concern. I do not share the conclusion. He paused. What he said next, he had not planned. It arrived the way true things sometimes arrive, not constructed, but simply present, waiting to be said. My wife is buried in Minnesota soil. She died on the way to this place, and I drove the rest of the way without her because this land was already paid for, and these children needed somewhere to go. This hill is all I have left for them. His voice did not break. It did not waver. But something in it changed, became very slightly, very precisely more direct. I will not be voting to abandon it. He walked out. Behind him, the trading post was silent for a long moment. Then, Vance said quietly, to no one in particular, God help those children. Emmy recovered in 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, she ate a full breakfast and asked when she could go look at the tunnel. And Lars laughed the first time he had laughed since Ingrid died, or the first time Olin had heard it and said soon. Olin looked at his father's face in the moment, after the laughter, and then looked away quickly, the way you look away from something that contains more feeling than you know how to meet directly. On December 15th, 1881, with snow already deep on the ground and temperatures dropping steadily below zero, Lars Solberg moved his family into the tunnel. They carried their possessions in over the course of a morning. Blankets, clothing, the cast iron pot, the small writing desk he had hauled from Norway. the papers from his father carefully protected in their leather satchel, the notebook with his own calculations, a small collection of books that he refused to leave behind regardless of weight. The firebox had been completed the previous week. The ventilation shaft was finished and fitted with its rotating cedar cap. The stone entry foundation was complete. The sleeping alcoves held straw-filled mattresses elevated off the clay floor on low timber frames. Canvas partitions hung across each alcove's opening. Olin carried the last load without comment. At the entry, he paused and looked back at the valley, at the other cabins visible in the distance, smoke rising from proper chimneys, real structures built of logs and stone by experienced men who had not needed a widower's 41 pages to tell them how to build. Then he ducked through the tunnel entry and went inside. That evening, Lars built the first fire in the corner stove. It was a small fire, deliberate, and considered not the roaring blaze a person might expect from someone trying to prove something or warm a space from nothing. A modest, efficient fire, feeding heat into the space and letting the earth do the work it had been doing quietly at 16 feet of depth for thousands of years before anyone arrived to ask anything of it. The temperature inside the primary chamber, measured by the thermometer he had brought from Minneapolis, reached 63 degrees Fahrenheit and held there. Outside, it was 12 degrees below zero and dropping. Olin sat on the timber frame of his sleeping alcove and looked at the walls, at the clay that curved gently above him, at the cedar-lined ventilation opening at the small flame in the corner stove, casting amber light across the chamber. He pressed his palm flat against the clay wall beside his alcove. Cool. Not cold. The temperature of a spring morning. He did not say anything, but he did not look back at the valley again. From Callaway's trading post visible through the front window, if you knew where to look, a thin thread of pale smoke rose from the peak of Anderson Hill. Cornelius Vance looked at it that evening as he settled in for the night before his stone fireplace, feeding the first of what would be many fires over the long winter ahead. 3 weeks, he said to Adelaide, who was sewing by the fire. Maybe, she said without looking up. That design will fail in deep cold, he said. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. Adelaide said nothing. She kept her eyes on her sewing. She had heard her husband's 7 points enumerated enough times to recite them herself, and she had long since stopped asking whether he might be wrong because the question had never, in 28 years of marriage, produced a useful conversation. She said nothing, but she noted the smoke, the thin, steady thread of it rising from the hillside in the cold, clear air, persistent and calm. She noted it and kept it and said nothing at all. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. The long Montana winter was just beginning to show what it was capable of. And, on the south face of Anderson Hill, in a chamber 16 feet below the frozen surface, the earth held its quiet temperature of 52 degrees, as it had held it for 1,000 years, before Lars Solberg arrived, and would hold it for 1,000 years after, indifferent to the opinions of everyone in Cutter's Creek, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. Cutter's Creek, Montana Territory. December 1881. The settlement had a particular rhythm in the weeks before deep cold arrived. It was not a comfortable rhythm. It was the rhythm of preparation, of men splitting wood until their shoulders gave out, of women rendering fat and salting meat and counting provisions against the long arithmetic of winter. Every household in Cutter's Creek understood that survival in Montana was not a passive condition. It required continuous, exhausting attention. The cold would come, and it would test everything, every joint in every wall, every cord of wood stacked against every cabin, every decision made in the easier months about what was sufficient and what was not. The smoke from Anderson Hill's peak continued to rise, thin, steady, pale against the gray December sky. It became, over the first weeks of December, a kind of landmark that the settlement noted without examining. Men riding past on the lower trail saw it the way they noted other things that didn't quite fit, with a sideways attention they didn't fully acknowledge, even to themselves. Calloway mentioned it once at the trading post in the tone of a man sharing information he hadn't decided how to categorize. "Still burning," he said on December 20th. "Small fire," Vance said without looking up from the harness he was mending. "He's rationing wood because he knows he can't heat that space properly, keeping them alive on scraps." Nobody challenged this. His interpretation was the interpretation the room adopted because it fit what everyone already believed, and because fitting what people already believe is the primary qualification for an interpretation to travel unchallenged. What none of them knew was what the smoke actually meant. The small fire was not evidence of rationing, it was evidence of sufficiency. Lars burned exactly what was needed to raise the ambient temperature from the Earth's constant 52 degrees to a comfortable living temperature. No more. Not because he was desperate, but because more was unnecessary, and he had not survived 40 years, and a dead wife and 6 weeks alone on the Montana Trail by wasting what he had. Inside the tunnel, December had a different quality than it had outside. Outside December in Cutter's Creek was a month of grinding endurance. Cabin interiors fluctuated between barely tolerable near the fireplace and genuinely dangerous near the walls. Condensation from breathing froze in crystal patterns on the inside of windows. Children wore their coats indoors. Families reorganized their sleeping arrangements to cluster near their heat sources, accepting proximity and discomfort as the price of warmth. Inside the tunnel, December was simply winter, viewed from a safe distance. The sleeping alcoves held a steady 66 degrees from the combination of earth temperature, the small firebox, and the body heat of 3 sleeping people contained by canvas partitions. Emmy slept with the uncomplicated depth of a healthy child in a warm bed. Sigrid read by lamplight in her alcove with a blanket across her lap, not because she needed it for warmth, but because it was comfortable. Olin had stopped mentioning the other cabins in the valley. He had also, Lars noticed, begun making small improvements without being asked. Tightening a canvas partition, remortaring a section of the entry stonework, he decided wasn't tight enough, splitting the reserve wood into more consistent sizes for better burning. He did these things quietly, in the manner of someone who has decided to care about a place. Lars kept his notebook current. Every evening he recorded the temperature at 3 points in the chamber floor level, mid-wall, and ceiling. He recorded the outside temperature from the small thermometer he had mounted at the tunnel entry. He recorded the amount of wood burned. He wrote his observations in the small, precise hand that was the only extravagance he permitted himself. By December 31st, he had burned 1 cord of wood since moving in. In the same period, the Vance household had burned 4 cords and was on pace for significantly more if the deep cold arrived as predicted. Adelaide Vance knew this because she was the one who counted. She counted everything. It was a habit developed over 28 years of managing a household in hard country where the difference between adequate and inadequate was frequently the difference between survival and its absence. She counted the wood stacks in September and again in November, and made calculations that she kept in her own small notebook, one that Cornelius knew existed, but had never asked to see, understanding, without discussion, that the numbers inside it were her domain. The numbers in November concerned her. Not catastrophically, but in the steady, quiet way that things concerned Adelaide Vance, without alarm, without drama, with the patient attention of someone who knows that small concerns unaddressed have a way of becoming large ones. She had looked at the thin smoke from Anderson Hill more than once in those December weeks. She had noticed its consistency. She had filed this observation in the part of her mind where she kept things she wasn't sure what to do with yet, and she had gone back to counting. January arrived the way January arrives in Montana. Not as a change from December, but as December's true intention finally revealed. The first week was cold in the way that Cutter's Creek understood cold. -10, -15. Temperatures that required respect and preparation and the continuous tending of fires, but that fell within the range of what experienced settlers had managed before. The second week changed the conversation entirely. On January 8th, the temperature dropped to -22 overnight. Vance woke at 2 in the morning to find the fire nearly out and the interior temperature of his cabin at 38 degrees, cold enough that the water in the pitcher on the nightstand had developed a skin of ice. He rebuilt the fire with the controlled urgency of a man who understood what the alternative looked like, and he did not go back to sleep. Adelaide woke at 4 and found him sitting in the chair nearest the fireplace, watching the flames. "Go back to bed," he said. "I'll sit with you," she said. She did. 2 nights later, their son, visiting from his own small claim 3 miles east, arrived at the door at midnight, having abandoned his cabin, which had dropped below 20 degrees. Despite a fire, he had been feeding every half hour. He spent the rest of the winter sleeping in his parents' front room, 6 feet from the fireplace. The Henderson family, whose cabin was smaller than the Vance house and whose fireplace drew less efficiently, was burning through wood at a rate that was beginning to concern their neighbors. Robert Henderson had stacked what he calculated as a full winter supply in September. By January 8th, more than a third of it was gone. Prentice Callaway, whose trading post served as the settlement's informal weather station and community gathering point, noted the increasing traffic. People who had been managing in their separate cabins began appearing at the trading post in the mornings, not just for provisions, but for warmth, for company, for the reassurance of a space with a large commercial stove and other human beings who were also cold and also tired and also counting their wood. "How much have you burned?" became the greeting of the second week of January, replacing good morning. The answers were worrying. Nobody asked about the smoke from Anderson Hill. It was still there, still thin, still steady, still rising from the hillside peak each morning and evening without interruption. But in the growing press of their own survival, nobody thought to calculate what that consistency implied. A family in crisis did not produce steady smoke. A family managing well did. January 10th, it was 3 in the morning when Robert Henderson smelled it. He was already awake. He had been sleeping in 40-minute intervals, waking to feed the fire, and the smell reached him before the light did. Smoke, but not fireplace smoke. The different smoke, the wrong smoke. He was out of bed before he was fully conscious of having decided to move. The fire had jumped to the firebox grate. A log had rolled or a coal had leapt. The exact sequence didn't matter, and he would never know it, and the dry timber of the cabin floor near the hearth had caught while he slept his 40-minute sleep. The flames were not yet high. There was still time. He grabbed the water bucket, already knowing it was frozen solid, and then he grabbed his wife and both children and got them out the door in their night clothes into air that was 28 degrees below zero. The cabin burned completely in 40 minutes. They stood in the snow and watched it go. The 4 of them with the silence of people for whom language has temporarily ceased to be relevant. The fire was warm at 40 feet. It was the warmest any of them had been in a week. Clara Henderson would say later that she had thought about moving closer and had been ashamed of the thought, and then had realized the shame was a luxury she couldn't afford, and had moved closer anyway. By 4 in the morning, 6 neighbors had arrived. The structure was gone. The Henderson family had the clothes they had run out in a horse that had been in the far paddock and nothing else. By 4:30, Lars Solberg was standing in his tunnel entry in his work shirt and coat, holding a lamp. "Bring them here," he said to the man who had come to tell him. He said it in the flat, decisive tone of someone who has already thought through the question and found it not particularly difficult. "The tunnel," he began, "is warm," Lars said. "Bring them." The Henderson family, Robert Clara, and their two children aged 9 and 12, moved into the Solberg tunnel for 3 days. 8 people in a space designed for 4. The primary chamber held them all. The temperature dropped 2 degrees from the additional body's respiratory heat exchange dropped and then stabilized because the earth behind the walls absorbed and redistributed without complaint. It did not panic. It did not fail. It simply adjusted to the new load and held. Lars had the Solberg children shift to the 2 smaller alcoves and gave the Henderson family the primary sleeping space. He managed the fire with the same deliberate precision he had applied since December, reading the temperature feeding the stove, exactly what it needed, nothing more. 61 degrees, 62, consistent. The Henderson children slept through their first night in the tunnel without waking. Robert Henderson sat near the corner stove on the second morning and looked at the clay walls and the cedar-lined ventilation opening and the small fire burning with its quality of sufficiency, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, "It's warmer in here than our cabin ever was." Clara Henderson heard it. She looked at Lars, who was at the small table reviewing his notebook. Lars did not respond. He kept his eyes on the notebook. But the corner of his mouth moved very slightly in a direction that was not quite a smile. 3 days later, when Calloway and 2 other men arrived with salvaged lumber to begin building the Hendersons, a temporary shelter, nobody mentioned to Cornelius Vance what temperature the tunnel had maintained. The Henderson family thanked Lars quietly and moved into their temporary quarters. The event was noted in the settlement as evidence of the fire risk inherent in conventional cabins, which it was, and absorbed into the ongoing narrative of winter survival without anyone pausing to examine what it implied about the alternative. Vance heard about the fire. He heard that Lars had taken the Hendersons in. He said it was a decent thing to do and went back to splitting wood. January 12th, the thermometer outside Callaway's trading post read -38 at dawn. By noon, it had risen to -35, which was the warmest it would be for the next 11 days. Cutter's Creek understood in the way that people understand things. Their bodies tell them before their minds have caught up that this was different. This was not cold in the normal range. This was the kind of cold that the older settlers spoke of in a specific register, not quite fear, but the close cousin of fear that comes from having seen what this temperature does to the unprepared. It does not kill slowly. It does not give warning. It kills with the mechanical efficiency of a process that has no awareness of the people caught in it, no malice, no interest in outcomes. It simply reduces temperature until cellular function ceases, and it does this to livestock and to children and to exhausted adults who fall asleep beside a fire that burns down while they sleep, and it does not distinguish between them. Cornelius Vance had seen it happen twice in his building years, both times to people who had adequate shelter by ordinary standards. Both times in temperatures not much below what the thermometer was reading on the morning of January 12th. He split wood for 4 hours that morning, building his interior stack to a height that Adelaide later said looked like a wall. He checked every chink in every log. He stuffed additional wool batting into the 2 window frames where he had felt draft. He checked the firebox draw and adjusted the damper and then checked it again. He was thorough. He was experienced. He had built this cabin himself, knew every joint and every weakness, and he addressed each weakness with the calm professionalism of someone who understood what was at stake. By evening, with the temperature outside at -40 and falling his cabin interior held 44 degrees near the walls and 62 degrees within 3 feet of the fireplace. A temperature differential of 18 degrees within the same room. The family lived effectively in a radius around the fire. They ate there, they slept there. Adelaide's sewing chair had been dragged to within 4 feet of the firebox. Cornelius sat on the other side. He fed the fire every 45 minutes. He had established this schedule on the first night and maintained it with the discipline of someone who understood that missing a feeding in this cold was not an inconvenience but a genuine danger. 45 minutes. He had a clock on the mantel that he checked with the regularity of a man on watch. Midnight. 45 minutes. 1:45. 2:30. Adelaide took the 3:15 feeding and the 4 o'clock. She did not ask to share this duty. She simply appeared at 3:15 the first night and built the fire up and went back to her chair, and they did not discuss it. They burned 2 cords in the first 4 days. At that rate, Vance calculated on the evening of January 14th, they would exhaust their wood supply before the cold broke. He had a secondary stack outside, half covered, that he could access if temperatures rose enough to make retrieval safe. He noted this in the part of his mind where he kept the important numbers and went back to watching the fire. 3 miles away, in the Henderson family's temporary shelter, hastily constructed, inadequately insulated, built in 3 days with salvaged material, conditions were considerably worse. Robert Henderson was burning wood at a rate that was no longer sustainable. 2 of his neighbors had brought additional wood, which helped, but the structure was simply not adequate for 40 below. The Henderson family was cold in a way that was becoming medical rather than merely uncomfortable. Clara Henderson had begun making mental comparisons she didn't share with her husband, the 3 days in the tunnel against these days in the temporary shelter, and the comparison was not flattering to the shelter. In the Vance cabin, the sound of the clock was the rhythm of survival. Tick. 45 minutes. Feed the fire. Tick. Adelaide, at the 4 o'clock feeding on January 15th, stood at the fireplace and looked through the front window at the dark Montana night. She could see just barely the hillside. She could see, or thought she could see, at the distance and in the darkness, the faint, thin thread of smoke from the peak of Anderson Hill. She stood there for a long moment, watching it. The smoke was steady, even now at 4 in the morning, on one of the coldest nights in living memory. It rose with the same calm consistency it had shown every morning and every evening since December. Not desperate, not erratic, steady. A family rationing wood in genuine crisis produced irregular smoke-heavy bursts when the cold became unbearable gaps, when they ran low, the uneven signature of desperation managing itself moment to moment. The smoke from Anderson Hill was not that. Adelaide Vance stood at her fireplace at 4 in the morning and fed her fire and watched the hillside and did not say anything. She went back to her chair. She picked up her sewing, which she was not actually doing. The light was wrong, and her hands were too cold for fine work. And she sat with the thought she had been circling for 2 weeks. She had grown up in Wisconsin. Her grandmother had been a woman from Minnesota, the daughter of Scandinavian settlers who had come to the upper Midwest in the 1840s when it was still raw country with hard winters and no margin for error. Her grandmother had told stories about those early winters, about the choices people made, the structures they built, the knowledge they brought from the old countries that people in the new ones sometimes didn't recognize as knowledge because it arrived wearing unfamiliar clothes. One of those stories Adelaide had heard once and not thought about again for 30 years, about a family in her grandmother's settlement who had survived a terrible winter in a house built into a hillside. Her grandmother had described it as a curiosity, a piece of old country ingenuity that the neighbors had thought strange, until the strange thing turned out to be the reason that family was still alive in February, while others were counting their dead. Adelaide Vance sat in her cold chair at 4 in the morning and fed her fire every 45 minutes and thought about her grandmother's story. Then she fed the fire and went back to her chair and said nothing. January 16th, minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The lowest temperature anyone in Cutter's Creek had recorded in living memory. Cornelius Vance was awake at dawn, as he had been at every dawn since January 12th. He looked at the thermometer through the front window. He had stopped going outside to read it when the temperature made the 30-second trip to the porch a meaningful physical risk, and he sat down heavily in the chair by the fire. 11 cords burned since November. 2.5 of those in the last 4 days alone. He thought about the Henderson family in their temporary shelter. He thought about the Garfield family, whose cabin had always drawn poorly, and old Marcus Webb, who lived alone and whose wood supply had never been adequate even in ordinary winters. He thought about what he should do and made the list of things in his mind that a man in his position made: visit Webb, send Adelaide to the Garfields, check the Henderson structure. He did not think about the tunnel. It had been reclassified in his mind from an act of concern to a completed judgment, assessed in December, found deficient, and that finding entered into the permanent record of his professional experience. The thin smoke from the hillside, when he noticed it at all, confirmed rather than challenged his assessment. Small fire, inadequate heat. A family surviving on the margin the way he had predicted they would. He was feeding the fire at 7:30 in the morning when Adelaide appeared, already dressed, her coat in her hands. "I'm going to check on the Solberg family," she said. He looked at her. "In this cold, it's a 10-minute walk." Adelaide. "I'll take the wool blanket," she said, "and the bread from yesterday, and the salt pork." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in her voice, not challenge, not argument, but a quality of decision that he recognized from 28 years of marriage as the tone that preceded actions that had already been taken in her mind. "The bread is already frozen," he said. "I know," she said. She put on her coat. He watched her wrap her scarf and pull on her heaviest gloves and check that her boots were properly laced. "You're expecting to find them in trouble?" he said. Adelaide looked at him. Her expression was careful, not closed, not guarded, but the face of a woman choosing her words with more care than usual. "I'm expecting to find them needing help," she said. "Yes." She went out. Cornelius Vance sat by his fire and listened to the clock and thought about the things he needed to do that day. After a while, he got up and looked through the front window at the hillside. He could see the smoke, thin and pale, rising from the peak. He stood there for a moment and then went back to his chair and fed the fire. Adelaide Vance had known cold her entire life. She had grown up in Wisconsin in a family that did not have excess of any kind. And cold had been a condition of childhood in the way that some conditions are constant, demanding, never entirely absent even in summer. She had come west with Cornelius and learned the specific grammar of Montana cold, which was different from Wisconsin cold in its ambition, if not its basic nature. She knew how to move in serious cold. She knew to breathe through her scarf, to keep her pace steady rather than fast, to monitor the feeling in her fingers and her face with the continuous low attention that serious cold required. She walked the 10 minutes to Anderson Hill in the methodical way she did most things. She was carrying the folded wool blanket under one arm and the basket under the other. The basket was heavy. She told herself she was bringing provisions. She told herself it was a Christian duty. She told herself, in the more honest part of her mind, that she kept largely private, that she needed to see for herself. She had been thinking about the smoke. She had been thinking about it since 4 in the morning, and before that, and before that. She had been thinking about it the way you think about something when you're not sure you're allowed to think about it directly, circling around it in the peripheral vision of your attention, approaching it sideways, because approaching it directly required admitting something she wasn't sure she was ready to admit. The smoke from Anderson Hill was not the smoke of a desperate family. She had known this for 2 weeks and had not let herself know it fully. She walked up the slight slope to the tunnel entry. The path had been cleared that morning. The stone arch of the entry was partially drifted, but accessible. She stood for a moment and looked at the carefully fitted sandstone at the recessed doorway, set 4 feet back from the exterior wall. She noticed for the first time what the design of the entry was actually doing. The vestibule space. The way the cold air had to turn twice before it could reach the interior door. She had walked past this entry a dozen times since December and seen a hole in a hillside. Now she saw something else, a deliberate air brake designed by someone who understood how cold air moved. She noticed it and filed it and knocked. Footsteps. The door opened. Lars Solberg stood in a wool shirt and work trousers, looking at Adelaide with calm blue eyes. No coat. No urgency. No hollow cheeks or desperate expression, or the exhausted relief that Adelaide had been preparing herself to encounter. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "Come in. Coffee's hot." The warmth was the first thing. It moved over Adelaide like a hand gentle encompassing complete. She stepped through the door, and the Montana winter ceased to exist. She stood in the entry vestibule, and the temperature was already different. She moved through the interior door into the primary chamber and stopped. Emmy Solberg was sitting on the floor, playing with a collection of small carved wooden animals. She looked up when Adelaide entered and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," with the effortless courtesy of a child who is comfortable in her own home. Sigrid was at the small desk, writing something, a book open beside her. She glanced up, nodded, and returned to her page. Olin was not present. He had gone to check on the livestock in the small paddock at the base of the hill. The corner stove held a fire. Adelaide looked at it. It was the size of a fire you would build to heat water for tea. Modest, deliberate, the fire of someone who has calculated exactly how much heat is needed and built accordingly without excess or drama. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. "Sit down," Lars said. He had already poured the coffee. He set a cup on the small table near Adelaide and sat down across from her in the unhurried way of a man with nowhere pressing to be. Adelaide sat. She set the frozen bread and the salt pork on the table. She set the wool blanket beside them. They sat there between the two of them, objects prepared for a crisis that had not materialized, slightly absurd in the warm amber light of the chamber. Lars looked at them and did not comment. Adelaide wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The coffee was hot. Properly hot. The stove had been holding adequate temperature for cooking, for comfort, for everything a family needed while outside the world was the coldest it had been in living memory. "How long has it been like this?" Adelaide asked. "Since we moved in," Lars said. "Through all of it, through the last 4 days. The temperature dropped 2 degrees when the coldest days began," Lars said. "It stabilized at 61. It has not gone below 61. Adelaide thought about the Vance cabin. 44 degrees near the walls, 62 within 3 feet of the fire, the clock on the mantel, the 45 minutes. Cornelius sitting in the chair watching the flames in the middle of the night. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the small thermometer she had borrowed from Dr. Greer the previous evening. He had pressed it into her hand without being asked without explanation, with the wordless efficiency of a man who understands what information is needed. She held it up. Lars nodded. She placed it at mid-wall height and waited. 64 degrees. She moved to a sleeping alcove, drew back the canvas partition, and held the thermometer inside. 67 degrees. She stood there for a moment with the thermometer in her hand. Then she put it away carefully and came back to the table and sat down and picked up her coffee. She sat in silence for a full 10 minutes. Lars did not fill the silence. He drank his coffee and waited with the patience of a man who has learned that some understandings need to arrive in their own time and cannot be hurried without being damaged. How much wood have you burned? Adelaide asked. Her voice was different now. Something had gone out of it. Not warmth, but a weight that had been there without her noticing until it was gone. Lars walked to the stack along the western wall. He counted. 1¼ cords since November, he said. There is another half cord split outside. We have not needed it. Adelaide did the arithmetic. In the same period, the Vance household had burned nearly 14 cords. She sat with that number, 14 against 1¼ She let it settle into her understanding with the gravity of a fact that cannot be argued with, only absorbed. It was not a small difference. It was not a marginal efficiency. It was a ratio that changed what winter meant, changed what survival cost, changed what was possible, changed everything she thought she knew about what a family needed to live through January in Montana. And then beneath the arithmetic, something else arrived. Her grandmother's story. The family in the Minnesota settlement who had built into a hillside. The neighbors who had thought it strange. The February when strange turned out to be the reason they were alive. Her grandmother had told that story once. Adelaide had been perhaps 12 years old. She had heard it, filed it as a curiosity from the old country, and not thought about it again for 30 years. The knowledge had been there, in her own family's memory, told to her by a woman who had seen it with her own eyes, and she had let it go because it had arrived wearing the clothes of the past, of the old country, of the way things used to be done before people knew better. She had not known better. She had only known differently. Then Adelaide Vance, who was 50 years old and had been cold for 5 days and had slept in 45-minute intervals since January 12th, and had been holding herself together with the discipline of someone who understands that falling apart is a luxury unavailable to those who are needed. Adelaide Vance put her face in her hands and wept. Not from sorrow, not from shame exactly, though shame was present. From something more complicated, the release of a person who has been very cold for a very long time and has just unexpectedly come into warmth, and whose body understands before their mind does what that means. And from the recognition of what she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it, the memory of a story that could have mattered and hadn't, because she had never thought to ask whether it might. Lars sat across from her and said nothing. He did not reach out. He did not offer words. He simply sat there present and let Adelaide feel what she felt, because some things need to be felt before they can be understood, and understanding was what Adelaide was going to need. After a few minutes, Adelaide raised her head. Her face was composed. Cornelius is going to need to see this, she said. Lars looked at her. He won't believe me otherwise, Adelaide said. It was not a criticism of her husband. It was a precise statement of fact delivered by a woman who knew the man she had married. He needs to come here and measure it himself. I know, Lars said. He's a proud man. I know that too. Adelaide looked at him for a moment. Are you going to make it difficult for him? Lars considered the question with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. No, he said. He built extensively in hard country. He knows things I don't. If he's willing to look at this honestly, I want him to understand it, not to be humiliated by it. Adelaide nodded slowly. Outside, the temperature was still minus 42, still the coldest day in Cutter's Creek's living memory. Still testing every structure, every wood supply, every decision that had been made in the easier months. Inside the tunnel, the earth held its steady temperature. The small fire burned its deliberate burn. Emmy moved her carved animals across the floor with the sound effects of a child deep in an imaginary world where it was always warm. Adelaide Vance picked up her frozen bread, her salt pork, and her wool blanket. She looked at them. Then she set them back down. "Keep them," she said, "for the Henderson children." For she put on her coat and her gloves and her scarf, preparing herself for the cold that waited 10 minutes away. At the door, she paused. "Mr. Solberg," she said. Lars looked up. Adelaide opened her mouth, then closed it. Whatever she had been about to say seemed to reorganize itself into something simpler and more true. "I'll send Cornelius tomorrow," she said. She went out. The door closed. The cold was gone. Lars sat for a moment in the warm amber quiet of the chamber. Emmy's sound effects continued. The fire made its small, consistent sound. The ventilation shaft drew the air in its gentle, engineered current as it had drawn it every day since December, as it would draw it every day until spring. He opened his notebook. He wrote the date, January 16th, 1882. He wrote the outside temperature. He wrote the interior temperature. He wrote the amount of wood burned. Then he wrote, in the small, precise hand that was the only extravagance he permitted himself, "Adelaide Vance visited today." He closed the notebook. Outside, a thread of pale smoke rose from the peak of Anderson Hill into the iron-gray Montana sky. Thin, steady, calm. The same as it had been every day since December, and the same as it would be tomorrow and the day after that. Cutters Creek, Montana territory, January 20th, 1882. Cornelius Vance arrived at Anderson Hill at 8 in the morning. He came alone. He had told Adelaide he was going to check on the Solberg family, using the neutral language a man uses when he has decided to do something and does not yet want to attach a larger meaning to it. He carried a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket, his original 7-point assessment written in his own hand the previous September. He carried a steel measuring tape. He carried a small notebook and 2 pencils. He did not carry expectations, or told himself he didn't. The path to the tunnel entry had been cleared again that morning. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and someone had been out before first light with a shovel. Vance noted this without comment, adding it to the inventory of observations he had been unconsciously compiling since Adelaide had come home 3 days earlier and sat down at the kitchen table and told him what she had found. She had not been dramatic about it. Adelaide was not a dramatic woman. She had sat down and told him the temperature readings in a flat, precise voice, and she had told him the wood consumption numbers, and she had told him about Emmy on the floor, and Sigrid reading, and the coffee hot on the stove. She had told him everything she had observed, and nothing she had felt, and then she had looked at him across the table and waited. He had said nothing for a long time. Then he had said the thermometer could be off. Adelaide had looked at him. "Greer's thermometer," he said. "It might not be calibrated." "It's the same thermometer he uses for patients," Adelaide said. Another silence. "I'll go," he said. Adelaide had nodded and gone to tend the fire. They had not spoken of it again that evening, but Vance had fed the fire that night with a different quality of attention, less automatic, more deliberate, as if he were for the first time actually seeing what he was doing, rather than simply performing it. 2 chords in 4 days. He had done the arithmetic, and he had not liked it. Now, he stood at the tunnel entry in the early morning cold, -31, a warming trend that still required full winter gear, and looked at the stone archway with the attention of a man attempting to determine which of two conflicting things to trust: his professional judgment or the evidence about to contradict it. The stonework was better than he remembered. Not fine masonry, but considerably better than he had catalogued in December. More carefully fitted, the joints chinked with a precision that required time and deliberation. He looked at the recessed entry, the 4-foot vestibule he had assessed in September as a cold trap design error, and tried to trace the air movement. Cold air coming in at ground level, hitting the exterior wall, having to turn, then hitting the interior door, having to turn again, losing momentum and temperature at each change of direction. Not a cold trap. A cold break. He stood there for a moment with this small revision sitting in his chest like a coal, warm, uncomfortable, requiring acknowledgement. He knocked. Lars opened the door, wearing his wool shirt. He looked at Vance with his calm blue eyes and stepped back from the doorway without a word. Vance came in. The warmth was immediate and complete. He had prepared himself for it, or thought he had. The preparation had been inadequate. Warmth was not the right word for what he walked into. The right word was stability. The air was not fighting anything. It was simply what it was: settled and consistent. The temperature of a space that had reached equilibrium and remained there untroubled by the drama occurring 16 feet above it. He stopped just inside the interior door. Emmy looked up from the floor. "Good morning, Mr. Vance." He looked at her. Pink cheeks, clear eyes, bare feet on the clay floor. He looked at the floor. He crouched down and pressed his palm flat against it. Cool. Not cold. The temperature of a spring cellar. Not the frozen ground he had expected, but something alive and temperate holding its own. He stood up. Lars was at the small table. He did not offer coffee. He did not offer anything. He watched Vance with the patience of a man who has already decided how he is going to conduct this encounter and is waiting for it to proceed. Vance took out his measuring tape. He measured the primary chamber. 12 feet wide, 14 feet long, 8-foot ceiling. He wrote the numbers in his notebook. He moved to the corner firebox and crouched in front of it. The fire was small, the same modest fire he had interpreted from a distance as evidence of desperation. He put his hand near the firebox opening and felt the draw. Steady, efficient. He traced the horizontal flue run with his eye to where it angled upward toward the ventilation shaft. He thought about what Lars had said in September. The horizontal run creates a heat exchanger effect. He had dismissed it. He had dismissed it because it came from a man with inherited notes and no building record in this territory, and because his experience told him flue runs needed vertical orientation for adequate draw. He had been so certain. The draw was adequate. He could feel it in the way the fire behaved, in the way the smoke moved cleanly upward, with no accumulation in the absence of the backdraft he had predicted. He wrote something in his notebook. He moved to the ventilation shaft, opening in the ceiling, the cedar-lined bore he had assessed in November as technically acceptable, while privately doubting its performance. He held his hand near it. A gentle, consistent current moved upward. Not cold air descending, warm air rising, pulling fresh air in through the entry vestibule behind it. A circulation pattern that was entirely deliberate and entirely functional. He took out Greer's thermometer borrowed that morning without explanation and placed it at mid-wall height. He waited. 63 degrees. He moved to a sleeping alcove and placed the thermometer inside. 66 degrees. He stood in the alcove for a long moment, the canvas partition, the sleeping platform elevated off the floor, the body heat of a sleeping person concentrated by the earth walls on three sides, individual thermal chambers, each one holding more warmth than the space outside them, requiring nothing but presence to maintain. He came back to the primary chamber and stood in the center of it. He looked at the walls. He did what he had not done in December, had not done in September, had not done at any point in his months of confident assessment. He put his hand flat against the clay wall and simply felt it. Cool. 50-something degrees. Not cold. Not hostile. The temperature of Earth at depth, steady and patient and indifferent to everything above it. He stood with his hand against the wall for a long time. The mathematics were not complicated. His own fireplace was fighting an outside temperature of -30. The temperature differential his firebox was working against was more than 90 degrees. Every log he burned, the cold reached through his walls and took the vast majority of what that log had produced. He was spending wood to fight cold, and the cold was winning a slow war of attrition. Lars's firebox was raising the ambient temperature from 52 degrees to 63. 11 degrees of differential. It wasn't fighting the outside air. It was nudging the Earth's own baseline by 11 degrees. The Earth did the rest, had been doing it quietly, and without any requirement for firewood since long before anyone arrived to notice. He had not understood this in September. He had not understood it because he had never needed to. Every structure he had built was above grade, working against the cold in the way that above grade structures work against cold. He had never questioned this because it had never failed catastrophically. The things that don't fail catastrophically don't teach you what's possible, only what's sufficient. The Earth had been offering something better than sufficient for thousands of years, and nobody in Cutter's Creek had thought to ask it. He turned around. Lars was watching him. He had not moved from the table. He had not explained anything, had not guided the examination, had not said a single word since letting him in. He had simply let him look with the confidence of someone who knows that the truth will speak for itself if given adequate space to do so. Vance took the folded paper from his coat pocket. His 7-point assessment. He unfolded it on the table in front of Lars. Lars looked at it. Then he looked at Vance. Vance sat down across from him. Moisture condensation on clay walls in temperature differentials, he read aloud. He paused. In autumn, when warm air meets cool earth, condensation occurs, he said. In deep winter, the dynamic reverses. The earth is warmer than the outside air. Moisture moves outward into the frozen soil. The ventilation shaft removes what remains before it accumulates. He looked at the paper. I was wrong on this point. Lars said nothing. Inadequate firebox capacity for the cubic footage. He looked at the corner stove. He looked at his temperature readings. He set his pencil to the paper and crossed through the second point with a single, deliberate line. The firebox capacity is precisely adequate because it is not heating against the outside air temperature. It is heating against the earth temperature. 11 degrees of differential. I calculated for a differential of nearly 100 degrees because I did not understand the thermal principle at work. He paused. I was wrong on this point. He went through all 7. Frost heave, risk on the ceiling clay wrong. The clay at this depth does not freeze. He had assumed frost penetration reached 16 feet. It does not reach 16 feet. He had applied surface clay behavior to deep clay without verifying that the behavior was the same. It was not. Compromised structural integrity without timber framing wrong. The clay at this depth and this consistency at this hillside angle provided self-supporting structural integrity that did not require timber intervention. He had been thinking about surface clay. He had not thought carefully enough about what clay becomes under its own pressure at depth. Ventilation shaft, susceptible to wind shear, collapse wrong. The rotating cedar cap, which he had dismissed as decorative in September, served a specific engineering function. It allowed the shaft exit to orient away from the prevailing wind direction, preventing the downdraft that would otherwise compromise the draw. It was not cosmetic. It was a wind vane and a pressure equalizer built into a single rotating piece. Smoke management in a below grade space, wrong. The circulation pattern created by the ventilation system, warm air rising, fresh air drawing through the entry vestibule, continuous, gentle exchange was more effective than the management in any above grade structure he had built. There was no smoke accumulation, there was no backdraft, there was simply a system working as designed. Entry vestibule, creating a cold trap wrong, the opposite of wrong. He had stood at the entry this morning and seen it himself. The double turn design broke cold air momentum in a way that a single exterior door in a conventional cabin wall could not approach. He had called it a flaw. It was the most sophisticated element in the design. 7 points, 7 errors. He sat across from Lars Solberg at the small table in the 63-degree earth chamber and crossed through all 7 of them in his own handwriting one by one, reading each correction aloud in the careful, deliberate voice he used when precision mattered. When he finished, he put the pencil down. Emmy had drifted closer during this process, drawn by the sound of adult voices in a serious register. She was sitting a few feet away, with her wooden animals no longer playing with them, watching Cornelius Vance, with the frank curiosity of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend not to be interested in what adults are saying to each other. Vance looked at the crossed-out paper for a long moment. Then he looked up at Lars. "This isn't your father's design," he said. It was not a question, but Lars treated it as one. "The principles are his," he said. "The application is mine. The ventilation angle? The Finnmark Gam is built for a different hillside geometry. I recalculated for Anderson Hill specifically. The firebox placement relative to the prevailing wind. The northwest wind breaks against the ridge above. It changes the pressure differential at the shaft exit. I accounted for that." Vance looked at him. He was a man who had spent 30 years being the most knowledgeable person in any room that contained a discussion about construction. And he was sitting across from a man who had, in his first structure, produced something he could not have produced, not because he lacked technical capability, but because he had lacked the fundamental question. He had never asked what the earth could do for a structure, because he had never needed to ask it. His way had worked well enough. Well enough had been sufficient. Lars had not had the luxury of sufficient. He had come to this territory with no money and no wife and 3 children, and 1 piece of land that every experienced man in the settlement had passed on. Necessity had opened a door that 30 years of professional competence had kept comfortably closed for Vance. Lars had needed to ask. So he had asked. And the earth had answered. "This is yours, Mr. Solberg," Vance said. He said it with the weight of a man returning something that has been misattributed, not as a compliment, but as a correction of record. Lars looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." Cornelius Vance left Anderson Hill 2 hours later with 12 pages of notes and the 7-point assessment crossed through in his own hand. He did not go home. He went to Calloway's trading post. Calloway was behind the counter sorting mail. He looked up when Vance came in, registered something in the man's face that he didn't immediately have words for, and set the mail down. "Prentice thought," Vance said. "I need you to call a meeting." "When?" "February 14th. Calloway looked at him. "That's 3.5 weeks." "I know. I need time to prepare what I'm going to say." Another look. Cornelius, what did you find up there? Vance set his notebook on the counter. He opened it to the first page of measurements. Calloway read. His expression moved through several stages that Calloway, who was not a man given to visible reaction, did not usually permit himself. This can't be right, he said. I measured it myself, Vance said, with Greer's thermometer, the same one he uses for patients. Calloway read further. He got to the wood consumption comparison and stopped. 14, Vance said, against 1.25. Since November. Calloway set the notebook down very carefully, the way a person sets something down when they want to make sure their hands are not shaking. February 14th, he said. Every head of household, Vance said. Everyone who was at the September meeting. He picked up his notebook and walked out. The cold broke on January 23rd. Not warmth, not by any reasonable measure, but a rise to -12 that felt after 11 days of -35 and below like something close to reprieve. Fires were fed less desperately. People emerged from their cabins with the blinking, careful manner of those who have been through something and are not yet certain it is over. The settlement took inventory. The Garfield family had burned through their entire winter wood supply and required assistance from 3 neighbors. Old Marcus Webb had survived on a combination of his own diminishing reserves and daily deliveries from Calloway, who had organized this quietly without announcing it as charity. The Henderson family in their temporary shelter had been genuinely cold, not dangerously in the end, but the kind of cold that leaves a mark on the body's memory and does not entirely depart. Vance went to see each of them. He helped split additional wood. He assessed the Garfield cabin's draw problem and identified a damper adjustment that improved its efficiency by a meaningful margin. He brought Webb 3 cords from his own supply, which he could spare because the worst was past, and because he was doing arithmetic now all the time, and the arithmetic kept returning to the same number. 14 cords. He thought about it while he worked. He thought about what he had missed and why he had missed it, and what the cost of missing it had been, not catastrophic this time by the grace of adequate preparation and mutual aid, but costly in every measurable way. He thought about how he had stood at Calloway's counter in September and enumerated 7 reasons a widower's drawings were wrong. He thought about the quality of his certainty at that moment, how complete it had felt, how natural, how entirely reasonable, given everything he had built and learned and survived. He thought about Lars Solberg driving a wagon from Minneapolis to Montana, alone with 3 children and a dead wife's name stopping at Anderson Hill, and pressing his hand against the clay and asking a question Vance had never thought to ask in 30 years. He wrote for 3 weeks. Not the tunnel measurements, those were already complete and precise. He wrote what he was going to say at Calloway's trading post on February 14th, and he wrote it with the care he gave to structural calculations, because he understood that what he was building in those pages was something that would stand or collapse, depending entirely on whether it was honest. And he had learned in 30 years of building that structures which were not honestly made eventually showed you where the dishonesty was. February 14th, 1882. Calloway's Trading Post. 17 settlers, the same. 17 who had been present in September, plus 4 others who had heard about the meeting and asked to attend. Adelaide Vance sat in the second row. Lars Solberg stood near the back wall with Olin beside him. Vance stood at the front of the room where he had stood in September, but the posture was different. In September, he had stood with the authority of a man delivering a verdict. Now, he stood with the posture of a man who has something difficult to say and has decided to say it without softening it into something easier. He did not begin with an apology. He began with measurements. He read from his notebook the temperatures, the wood consumption figures, the detailed corrections to each of his 7 points. He went through them methodically, the way he had gone through them in the tunnel crossing, each one out with the same deliberateness he had applied to the written version. He explained the thermal principle, the earth temperature at depth, the differential. The firebox was actually working against the ventilation circulation in terms that experienced frontier settlers could follow without engineering background. He did not spare himself. When he described his original 7 points, he did not present them as reasonable professional caution that had turned out to be mistaken. He presented them as errors, and he explained specifically why each one was an error, and he explained what he had been thinking that had produced each error, because he had determined, in 3 weeks of writing, that a partial accounting was not an accounting at all. A man who admits he was wrong without explaining how he got there is not being honest. He is being strategic. Cornelius Vance was not being strategic. The room was very quiet. I have built structures across 3 territories, he said. I have worked in hard country for 30 years. I came into this room in September with an assessment I was certain of, and I was wrong on every single count. He paused. Not because the principles I know are wrong, because I applied them to a problem I didn't understand in place of trying to understand the problem first. He looked at the room. Mr. Solberg's design is not primitive. It is not a root cellar or a glorified hole in the ground. It is sophisticated engineering that is more effective by every measurable standard than any above grade structure I have built or seen built in this territory. He paused again. The ignorance in that September meeting was mine, not his. The room was silent in the way rooms are silent when something true has been said that changes the shape of things. Calloway cleared his throat. The wood consumption difference, he said. You stand behind those numbers. I measured them myself, Vance said. 1¼ cords against 14, since November. His interior temperature did not drop below 61 degrees during the cold snap. Mine did not exceed 62 within 3 feet of the fire. Silence. Why didn't any of us know about this? Said Robert Henderson from the 3rd row. He said it without accusation, with the genuine puzzlement of a man trying to understand a gap in his own knowledge. Earth sheltering. We've been building cabins for 30 years out here, and why didn't anyone know? Some people knew, Dr. Greer said quietly from the corner. He had been present since the beginning, silent until now. The Scandinavian settlers in Minnesota in the 1840s used the principle. The native peoples of this region used semi-subterranean structures for centuries before any of us arrived, solving the exact same thermal challenges in the exact same climate. The knowledge existed. It has always existed. We chose not to ask for it because it arrived wearing clothes we didn't recognize as knowledge. The room absorbed this. Lars said nothing. He had said nothing throughout. He stood near the back wall with his hands quiet at his sides, in the manner of someone who has already won the argument that matters and has no investment in the ceremony of being declared correct. The argument had been won in January by the thermometer and the woodpile and the 11 days of cold that had tested every structure in Cutter's Creek without prejudice. Olin stood beside him. He was watching Cornelius Vance with an expression that was not triumph and not satisfaction, but something more complicated. The expression of a boy who has watched his father be right about something that required paying a considerable price first, and who is still deciding what kind of man he wants to be in a world where that happens. The spring of 1882 arrived in Montana Territory with its usual combination of relief and new problems. Snow melt mud, the urgent brevity of a growing season that permitted no delay. 3 families approached Lars in the first week of March. The Garfields came first. Edmund Garfield was a methodical man who had sat through the February meeting, taking notes, and come back 3 days later with specific questions about soil assessment and ventilation shaft construction. He and Lars spent 2 afternoons at his property looking at hillside angles and ground composition. Lars showed him the soil testing he had done on Anderson Hill, the depth measurements, the temperature readings, the moisture content assessments at each interval. Garfield listened with the attention of a man who has understood that he is being taught something important and is not going to let pride interfere with the instruction. The Hendersons came next. Robert Henderson wanted to build on the hillside parcel adjacent to his burned property. He had an additional consideration. One, he stated plainly he never wanted to watch a fire take everything he had again. Earth shelters did not burn. The fire risk that had destroyed his cabin on January 10th was a risk that Lars's design simply did not contain. He broke ground in April. Broke ground. Third family was the Webbs, Marcus Webb's son, who had come from Wyoming Territory to help his father through the winter and had stayed when he saw what the land could offer. He was 28, practical, and entirely without the professional pride that had made his elders resistant. He absorbed Lars's instruction with the receptiveness of someone who has not yet accumulated enough experience to mistake it for certainty. And that receptiveness was worth more than any credential. Cornelius Vance came to each of these consultations, not to lead them, not to reclaim the authority he had surrendered. He came as a collaborator, bringing the structural knowledge accumulated across decades of building knowledge that was genuinely valuable, that Lars did not have and did not pretend to have. How to select and fit bearing stone, how to calculate structural load in earthen roofing, how to manage the timber framing at the entry vestibule, where the transition from earth to open air created stress points that required conventional carpentry. The first time they worked together at the Garfield property in late March, discussing entry vestibule construction, there was an awkwardness between them that neither of them addressed. They moved through it with the quiet professionalism of people who understand that the work matters more than the discomfort. By the second consultation, the awkwardness had diminished to almost nothing. By the third, it was simply two men who knew different things, working on the same problem, each contributing what they actually had, rather than what they wished they had. Adelaide watched this from a careful distance and said nothing, and felt something she would not find words for, until much later the satisfaction of a person who has been right about something without having needed to say so. By autumn of 1882, 11 families had approached Lars. He could not accommodate all of them simultaneously. He developed a system site assessments first, then a written construction guide based on his father's notes and his own adaptations, and the specific lessons of Anderson Hill's first winter, then on-site consultation during the critical phases of excavation and ventilation shaft installation. Vance handled the structural elements. Greer, who had begun attending the consultations as an observer and gradually became a participant, contributed his understanding of air quality and moisture management from a physiological standpoint that complemented the engineering. It was Lars' thought on an October evening, reviewing construction schedules for 4 simultaneous projects, an unlikely collaboration. A Norwegian widower, a 65-year-old physician, and a 59-year-old builder who had publicly declared his design fatally flawed, working together on hillsides across Cutter's Creek and the surrounding settlements, teaching people to ask the earth for help. He wrote this in his notebook in the small, precise hand. Not temperature readings or wood consumption figures, which filled most of the pages. Just this: an unlikely collaboration. But the earth doesn't care about likely. The years moved. By 1885, The Montana Territorial Census documented 47 earth shelter dwellings across 3 counties. Agricultural extension reports from the period noted fuel efficiency improvements ranging from 650% to 820% compared to conventional log construction, with the additional benefit of reduced fire risk. A territorial surveyor who visited in the summer of 1885 noted with the slightly bewildered tone of official documents encountering something unanticipated that the region had developed a distinctive vernacular construction tradition centered on earth integrated architecture. In 1886, Cornelius Vance wrote a letter to the Territorial Building Commission. He wrote it with the same care he had brought to his February remarks, precise, unsoftened, willing to say the uncomfortable thing directly rather than encoding it in professional language that preserved everyone's dignity at the cost of clarity. He described the thermal principles. He described the construction methodology. He attached Lars's written construction guide with his permission. He gave the wood consumption comparison from the winter of 1882 with exact figures. At the end of the letter, he wrote a paragraph that Callaway read aloud at the trading post when a copy arrived, and that was reprinted in 2 territorial newspapers, and that Lars copied into his notebook in his small, precise hand on the page following his October 1882 entry about the unlikely collaboration. We dismissed Mr. Solberg's design as ignorant because it was unfamiliar and because it came from a man speaking with a foreign accent and drawing from knowledge we did not recognize as knowledge. The ignorance was ours. We had mistaken unfamiliarity for primitivism and nearly cost a family their security through the exercise of our own arrogance. Any settler building in hard winter country should consider earth sheltering before defaulting to conventional above-grade construction. The knowledge exists. It has always existed. We need only the humility to ask for it. Lars read this when Callaway handed him the copy on a November morning. He read it standing at the trading post counter with his coat still on as he had stood at the same counter 5 years earlier and unrolled his drawings for 17 skeptical men. He read it twice, then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and thanked Callaway and walked back out into the November cold. He did not comment on it to anyone. But that evening in the tunnel, warmer than it had been in the first year, with the sleeping alcoves expanded and a second small lamp added, and a shelf of books that had grown considerably over 5 years of accumulation, he took the paper out and read it one more time. Then he put it in the leather satchel with his father's 41 pages. It belonged there, he thought, with the knowledge that had started all of it, with the words of a man who had crossed an ocean and pressed papers into his son's hands at a dock and said there will come a winter in America when you will need to know what the earth can do. He had been right. He had simply not been able to tell Lars when. The years continued. Olin Solberg grew into a man with his father's precision, and a carpenter's hands developed from years of building site work alongside Vance. He had learned 2 kinds of knowledge: the earth knowledge that came from his father's 41 pages, and his own years of watching Lars work, and the structural knowledge that came from Vance, who had taught him without ceremony in the manner of an experienced builder, passing things on because they need to be passed on, and the person in front of you is willing to receive them. In 1895, he married a woman from Billings named Ruth Ashford, and they built their own home, earth-sheltered southeast facing on a hillside parcel 2 miles from Anderson Hill. He designed it himself, adapting the principles his father had taught him for a slightly different soil composition and a steeper hillside angle. He got the ventilation shaft angle wrong on the first calculation and right on the second. And he noted the correction in a small notebook in a hand that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with his father's. The same small, precise script, the same habit of recording. Not just the answer, but the path to the answer, so that someone who came after would not have to find it again from the beginning. Lars lived in the Anderson Hill Tunnel until 1901, when his health required a move to Billings to be closer to Sigrid, who had married and settled there. He was 60 years old. He had lived in the tunnel for 20 years through 20 Montana winters, and the structure he had built at 40 had not failed him once. He left it to Olin, who maintained it alongside his own property with the attention of someone preserving something that mattered beyond its function. The winter he left, Olin walked through the tunnel alone one evening in January. He stood in the primary chamber and pressed his palm against the clay wall, the way he had seen his father do it 100 times, feeling the cool stability of the earth at depth, the 52 degrees that belonged to no season and no argument and no human opinion about what was possible. He stood there for a long time, then he went home. In 1923, Olin 58 years old. Now his father's gray appearing at his own temples, reinforced the tunnel structure with concrete following the advice of an engineer from Missoula who had visited the site as part of an early vernacular architecture study. The reinforcement was added at the entry vestibule and at 2 points along the primary chamber ceiling where decades of seasonal moisture cycling had produced minor clay movement. The core structure, the 16 feet of excavated clay, the sandstone foundation, the ventilation shaft lined with its original split cedar, now supplemented but not replaced, remained unchanged. The engineer from Missoula spent 3 hours in the tunnel taking measurements and making notes. Before he left, he stood in the primary chamber for a long moment, the way people stood in that chamber when they understood what they were standing in. "How old is this structure?" he asked. 42 years, Olin said. The engineer nodded slowly. He had the look of a man recalibrating something important. "The thermal performance, Keo," he said. "It's still same as the first winter," Olin said. The engineer wrote something in his notes. Then he looked up. "Who designed it?" "My father," Olin said. In 1968, researchers from Montana State University came to document what remained. The tunnel had been unoccupied since 1945, when Olin's son had made the move to Billings that the family's expanding circumstances had long made practical. The Anderson Hill parcel had been preserved through a series of property arrangements that reflected the family's understanding that the structure was something beyond a building, an argument made in clay and sandstone and carefully calculated angles that had been won decisively in January of 1882 and demonstrated continuously for 86 years since. The researchers arrived in January. Outside temperature, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. They entered the tunnel through the stone arch entry. The sandstone still fitted the joints, still holding after 87 years of Montana winters. The recessed vestibule, still breaking the cold air in its double turn, as it had done since the day Lars Solberg first designed it. They moved through the interior door into the primary chamber. Interior temperature, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire, no occupants, no heat source of any kind for 23 years. The earth at 16 feet of depth still held 54 degrees, as it had held it in January 1882, as it had held it every January before that, and every January since, as it would hold it long after the researchers packed their instruments and drove back to Missoula and wrote their report, which would use terms like passive geothermal and earth-integrated architecture and vernacular thermal engineering, and which would be filed in an academic archive where it would be read by the people who read academic archives, and occasionally from there make its way into the wider world. On the north wall of the primary chamber, partially obscured by the concrete reinforcement, added in 1923 but still legible in lamplight, something remained. One of the researchers moved his lamp closer. A drawing, faded pressed into the clay itself rather than drawn on any surface that could be removed or replaced. A cross section of a hillside with precise measurements marked at each critical point. An entry tunnel angling upward at a slight grade. A primary chamber with sleeping alcoves. A corner firebox with its horizontal flue run. A ventilation shaft angling upward through the hill's peak at 70 degrees. Below the drawing, in a small, precise hand, 2 lines of text. The researcher leaned closer and read them. The earth holds what it is given. We need only have the wisdom to ask. He stood in the 54-degree chamber for a long time. The Montana winter was locked outside. The drawing was in front of him. The silence in the chamber was the particular silence of places where something true was worked out, and the truth is still present in the walls. He wrote in his notebook, January 1968. Interior temperature, 54 degrees. Exterior temperature, 8 degrees. He looked at the drawing one more time, at the measurements, at the angles, at the small, precise hand that had pressed them into the clay decades before he was born. He wrote designer unknown. Then he stopped, looked at what he had written, crossed through the last 2 words with a single deliberate line. He wrote instead, designer Lars Solberg, Cutters Creek, Montana Territory, 1881. He closed his notebook. Outside, the January wind moved across Anderson Hill the same way it had always moved from the northwest, breaking against the ridge above, passing over the peak where a ventilation shaft cap still turned slowly in the current, still oriented away from the prevailing wind, still doing the small, precise mechanical work it had been designed to do. And far below, in the chamber where everything had been decided, the earth held its temperature, as it had always held it, patient, quiet, indifferent to doubt, waiting as it had always waited for someone willing to ask.